Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Horan. Hopefully you're here for our Managing Longleaf Pine Ecosystems in a Changing Climate, an Ecological Silviculture Approach. And today we have Steve Jack. He's the Executive Director of the Boggy Slough Conservation Area with T.L.L. Temple Foundation down in Lufkin, Texas. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Gwyneth, and you can get started for NCTC. Thanks to everyone for joining us.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today our webinar is titled Managing Longleaf Pine Ecosystems in Changing Climate, an Ecological Silviculture Approach with our own Dr. Steve Jack. And so we'll be introducing Steve a little bit more later. But he is the executive director of the Boggy Slough Conservation Area with T.L.L. Temple Foundation. But we're just going to start with a few little things to just get us started. I would like to start this week's topic with the National Conservation Training Center land acknowledgement. The National Conservation Training Center is located on ancestral lands of many indigenous people. These include, but are not limited to, the Massawomack, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. NCTC is dedicated to building relationships with indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn about the lands in which they reside in as well. I'd be happy to share a link with those who are interested so you can learn more about the inhabitants of the land where you live and work. I would also like to mention at NCTC, we welcome all students. It is my intention to create a safe and inclusive and productive webinar environment that honors and supports diverse ideas. We are strengthened by the diverse perspectives and identities, and we foster the environment where everyone can learn new skills. As such, I will be an ally in this event to anyone who experiences any issues and feels unwelcome. You may always reach out to me privately in the chat to discuss your concerns. I'd also like to have a disclaimer that the views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mentions of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not imply federal endorsement. And also just some quick pointers to help you out. You are all muted, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to talk to each other. You can go and invite yourself in the chat and tell us who you are and where you're coming in from. And make sure when you do type in the chat box to select everyone in the drop-down menu, just so everyone can hear you and see what you want to say, with the exception of just the panelists. Also, for the best viewing experience, make sure to go to my view, which is the 4 little dots, and go all the way down to side-by-side gallery view. We do have interpreters on this call, so if you need visual aids, we have sign language provided, and we also have a closed captioner if you're interested in that. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. You can go and take it away.
Thanks, Gwyneth. So my name's Jeff Horan. I help coordinate and host this series for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This particular webinar series is a product of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forestry Working Group, our science applications, migratory bird programs, and also our National Conservation Training Center. But we have partners, and the USDA, Northern Forest Climate Hub, and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science have been huge in helping us put on this particular series. And you can see on your screen there contacts for the series if you have questions, or if you need to have CEU credits or SAF credits, you can contact Jim Siegel, and his email is below. If you can go to the next one, please. And so many of you know that we have been broadcasting these 12-part webinar series, and this happens to be our 6th in this 12-part series on ecological forestry in the context of climate change. So in this particular webinar series, it tells the story of how small and large-scale forest disturbance such as fire, wind, ice storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, and introducing endemic pests really impact these forest ecosystems. The series will also examine ecological silviculture and climate adaptation approaches to help inform forest and wildlife management. And also, just to do a commercial, next month we're going to have Tara Kaiser on March 19th. She's with the USDA Forest Service at the Southern Research Center, and she's going to be talking about ecological silviculture for Southern Appalachian hardwood forests. And I've been down there on that forest, and she has some cool stuff going on. So I hope you are able to join us for that. Thanks, Gwyneth. Next, please. Now, chance to introduce Steve Jack. And we really appreciate Steve sharing his knowledge with us. Steve is the executive director of the Boggy Slough Conservation Area down at the T.L.L. Temple Foundation. It's down in Lufkin, Texas. Steve received his BS degree from Erskine College, an MS from University of Florida, and a PhD in silviculture and forest ecology from Utah State University. He has been executive director for the Boggy Slough since January of 2019. He previously was on the faculty of Texas A&M University and was a conservation ecologist at the Jones Center at Edgeway in Southwest Georgia for 20 years. So Steve has some serious experience. He tells me now, though, so his current position involves development and management of research and outreach programs for the Boggy Slough Conservation Area, as well as overseeing natural resource management of 19,000 acres. And his previous research focused on silvicultural practices in open pine forests, with particular attention to canopy structure and dynamics. And you guys are going to hear about that today. And he says right now he's more of a practitioner than a researcher. So we look forward to hearing the presentation, Steve. And again, thanks so much for being part of this. With that, I'm going to duck out and listen. Thank you.
All right, Steve, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can go ahead and bring yours up.
All right, did that come up?
Yeah, you're all good. I'll take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming in today. You know, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, since it's longleaf pine, is from my time at the Jones Center and there in Southwest Georgia, as well as other parts in the Southeast. And some of my earlier slides, I'm going to be going over just some basics about longleaf pine. I just seeing the chat notices go by, there's a lot of familiar names, a lot of friends of mine, a lot of people from the Southeast, so it's going to be a lot of repetition. There's also some folks from the Jones Center here, so you know, I'll give them credit now, because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is not just from me, but it's from the whole staff of the Jones Center, both long time ago and at present. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar with longleaf pine, it had a pretty wide distribution across the southeastern coastal plain. Best estimates are somewhere around 92 million acres, but by the 1990s, less than 5% of that. So gone from 92 million acres to 3.4 million acres, I think was the number, something like that. And what was left is highly fragmented. It is a very diverse temperate ecosystem, and some pictures there on the right show some of the different forest types. It's found on a lot of different soils types, which is shown in the map there. So you have the Piedmont and the mountain longleaf pine, so-called, in Georgia and Alabama, a lot on the sand hills in different states, especially Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina. A whole lot of the Mesic coastal plain, and then the flatwoods, the really wet sites that are in Florida and along the coastal areas. So a lot of different forest types are a lot of soil types and forest types are part of that longleaf pine ecosystem. But it has a lot of endemic plants and some threatened and endangered species associated with it. And it, of course, is called a fire forest. So it's dependent on maintaining fire in that ecosystem to maintain the ecosystem. And it is another interesting thing about longleaf pine is it is the longest lived of the southern pines, can live to be 400 years plus. And that is quite a bit different from the other three major southern pines. In terms of structure and dynamics, it is driven by a lot of disturbances and competition. Of course, one of the major disturbances is fire. But that some people would argue that fire is almost not a disturbance, because in longleaf pine, without fire, you don't maintain the longleaf pine structure and composition. But nonetheless, fire is a disturbance along with water and wind. And as those disturbances act on the forest, that affects the competition and the composition that you find in those forests. And if left alone long enough with enough fire, then you tend to end up with a multi-age structure in the forest. So some of those overstory disturbances that you have, of course, we mentioned water, and people often don't think about that with longleaf pine, but it can, in certain situations, water can be a pretty big disturbance. Of course, you have different types of fires. The canopy replacing fires are less common in a fire-maintained longleaf pine forest. They can occur in some situations. Of course, you have the windstorms, and recently some of those have been more prevalent, and we'll talk some about that later in the presentation. But one that's also probably the most common is lightning. You have these long-lived trees out there. They grow in areas that have a lot of lightning storms, and so lightning is a frequent disturbance and often tends to form these small-scale openings in the canopy. So rather than a big windstorm, which knocks down most of the canopy, things like lightning, small wind events tend to create smaller openings in the canopy. So one way that this has been shown, this goes back quite a ways to Bill Michener and his group when Bill was at the Jones Center, is trying to look at a map of the spatial extent of the disturbances versus how frequent they are. And so his lab at that time was looking a lot at even these very small scale disturbances and the effects on plant regeneration. But the things that I've just talked about with canopy disturbances, lightning is spatially is not very large, but happens quite frequently. Notice the logarithmic scale there. Prescribed burning happens a little less frequently, typically 2 to 3 or 4 years in a longleaf pine system, but it covers a lot bigger areas. And then in natural systems anyway, these large scale catastrophic sorts of events happen over very large areas, but tend to be very infrequent. So if we think about the natural disturbance regime, that's sort of the scale and frequency relationship that we think about in longleaf pine forests. So there's also been a lot of interest in restoring the longleaf pine forest, especially with the America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative, which started up in their range-wide plan for conservation that came out in 2010, and they just created a new one last year that goes from 2025 through 2040. And really, I realized that just now that I've repeated some of the information here, but this was some work done quite a while ago in Georgia, just looking about if this is the natural range of longleaf pine through Georgia. Excuse me, hit the wrong button. You can see in terms of the fragmentation, even though we talk about we're within the longleaf pine range, these are the larger acreages of longleaf pine left. So it's a very fragmented system, which also is one of the reasons for restoring it. It once was prevalent over that 92 million acres across the entire Southeast coastal plain. And now what you tend to find are these very fragmented sorts of areas where you have predominantly the longleaf pine forests. So in terms of the high diversity and conservation values, there is the ground cover plant community, which is where the really high plant diversity occurs. When you've got longleaf pine dominating the overstory, that's not overly diverse, but the ground cover is where you have a lot of that diversity. And of course, there is a high diversity of wildlife species. And I've shown here some of the ETS species, at-risk sorts of species that are often thought about with longleaf pine, but there's also a lot of species managed for game. One of the big ones in Georgia and Florida is northern bobwhite, and a lot of existing longleaf pine forest in that part of the world is actually associated with some of these plantations, as they're called, for harvesting quail. And so they're managed as longleaf, fire maintained longleaf pine forest, because that's good habitat for quail as well. And of course, one of the more interesting things, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is in terms of the ecosystem services associated with these longleaf pine forests, both in terms of carbon sequestration, but also water. And there's been a lot of work in recent years looking at especially water yields from natural fire maintained longleaf pine systems and versus some other forested type systems and other land covers as well. And there's some real interesting work in that arena, and more attention to the carbon sequestration, because these forests tend to be managed for the long term. So that's another really high conservation value that can be associated with these forests beyond the biological diversity sorts of aspects. So if we want to manage the longleaf pine forest for those diversity and conservation objectives, what do most people have in mind? And I've got just some example pictures there, but the list on the left that you can see, often think about more of an open canopy kind of forest, multi-aged, different age classes present in the forest, heterogeneous in both the spacing between trees and also somewhat in the vertical heterogeneity, although there's not much of a mid-story in these forests, but you do have some in the ground cover and some of the regeneration and things like that. So vertical and horizontal heterogeneity in the spacing of the trees that you have in that forest. Again, the high diversity, but also thinking about having some old trees in the forests. And so this particular picture right here is from an old growth forest near Thomasville, Georgia, showing some large old trees that are part of that forest. And that is one of the components that's often desired, as well as having some component of the dead, decaying wood out in the system for the different ecological values associated with it as well. So if those are sort of our desired conditions, the thing to think about is how do we get to it? Because with the fragmented landscape of longleaf pine forests that are out there, and the fact that most of them, or very few of them, are in that very old state, if we want to get towards that kind of structure and composition, how do we think about it? And the way that we've thought about that for quite a while, or I say we, when I was still at the Jones Center, the way of thinking about that with longleaf pine is through an ecological forestry, ecological silviculture approach. So Tony D'Amato did a presentation in this series back in September, I believe it was, on some of the background of ecological silviculture. So I just pulled the definition and some of the elements in that approach from his presentation. So you can see there, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, an ecological silviculture approach, applying an understanding of the structure, function, and dynamics of a natural forest to achieve the integrated environmental, economic, and social outcomes, which is, if you're really interested in a lot of details, I'm not going to spend the time on it today. You can go back to Tony's presentation, which is online, and hear a lot of the differences and the differences between the ecological silviculture approach and a more commodity or commercial-based approach to forestry. And in thinking about that approach, then you want to manage for continuity, having things carry over between the different developmental stages, the complexity and diversity, some of the characteristics I've already talked about with longleaf pine. Thinking also about the timing of disturbances and treatments when you are working in that forest, and how when to do treatments, and especially relative to the frequency of natural disturbances, and then also putting that into the larger landscape context. In a forestry sense, we often think about forest stands and making a prescription for a single stand. But in the ecological silviculture approach, it's not just that one unit that you're worried about. You have to think about the landscape context and how what you're doing on any one given unit affects and relates to what's going on around it in a larger context. So those are some of the things to think about with an ecological silviculture approach. And so then carrying those concepts over to longleaf pine, what I'm going to cover from here on out is more, how do some of those ideas apply to this longleaf pine forest that I've been describing to you. And I'm going to be drawing a lot from a book chapter, again, the book that was edited by Brian Palak and Tony D'Amato, and Tony referred to in his presentation, this newly published Ecological Silvicultural Systems. And my colleagues and I, Ben Knapp and Kevin McIntyre, we wrote a chapter for that book on longleaf pine, and that's what I'm going to be drawing from. And so the way that we approach that and thinking about how to apply ecological silviculture principles to longleaf pine is thinking about where you're starting from. So you could have an example like this where things already look pretty good, and a lot of those characteristics, those desired characteristics that we think about for longleaf pine are already present. On the other hand, you could have forests where there is a component of longleaf pine in the canopy, but it's a pretty degraded state, and it's not really anything like, at this point in time, what we're looking for in the desired conditions of a longleaf pine forest. And then, especially for restoration perspectives, there's a lot of interest in longleaf pine plantations. How do we get longleaf pine back on the landscape? And once we do get that established in a plantation, how do we then begin to work to move it towards more of those desired conditions, both the composition and the structure and the diversity? So the way we approached it in that book chapter, and what I'm showing here is the sequences from some of these different starting points. So on the top, what you have is the developmental stages, and then the 3 different starting conditions that I had pictures of there. And so don't have time to go through all of this. You can look at the recording of this or the slides of this at another time to get the details. But basically, looking at right after a disturbance, an early establishment of the forest, a younger forest, and then to a mature forest, and then to a much older forest. And it's really these kind of stages that we want to move to in those desired conditions. So if you've already got a fairly well-established and fire-maintained longleaf pine forest, then these sorts of conditions, these developmental conditions, are really small scale and they're scattered throughout the forest. So in that sense, really what you're looking at is just maintaining fire. As you get to these older stages, then you start bringing in different sorts of harvest treatments and ways of managing the forest to release regeneration and things like that. And in the examples that we look at, we tend to think about more of selection-based harvests, whether it's individual tree selection or group selection of different sorts, sometimes groups with retention. So if you're in a maintenance mode, we're trying to maintain what we've got, but you still have to think about having some of these other developmental stages as part of that overall forest matrix. If you're starting from a longleaf pine plantation and you want to move it towards those older stages with the desired characteristics, then at the beginning, you're starting generally with not much there, and you're starting with bare ground of some sort or nearly bare ground, and you're planting the longleaf pine seedlings. You have a young forest, and then through various ways you manage that young forest, which is still pines and lines, and begin to transition it to the structure and composition that you have in those older forests. And so you can see through different kinds of intermediate thinning applied in different ways and at different times, you can begin to move towards these situations. And all of this, I'm going to show you some examples a little bit later here. The other restoration starting point that talked about earlier was if you've got a degraded longleaf pine forest. In some cases, it may be that longleaf pine is present in the canopy. There's the term that's out there, especially with the U.S. Forest Service, of the minor manageable component of longleaf pine. If you have that longleaf pine, you can, through the ways that you work and harvest in that forest, you can preferentially leave longleaf pine in the overstory and move through these different stages. If it does not have longleaf pine in the overstory, and there are a lot of examples of that, where you can transition from a different species of pine towards a longleaf pine dominated canopy. And the way that starts is by utilizing that other pine species as the overstory and underplanting some longleaf pine seedlings and then managing them up to where they begin to recruit into the canopy. And over a long period of time, you end up replacing the other pine species and having a longleaf dominant forest. I shouldn't say replacing, because it'll probably still be out there as part of the composition, but hopefully you move to a dominant longleaf pine overstory over time. So this is the way that we organized it in that book chapter of the different starting points and how you move through these different stages of development to get to those desired conditions that we think about with natural longleaf pine forests. The key, of course, to all of those trajectories is fire. If you looked in any detail at that table, you saw it pretty much in every cell of that table. The first thing that was mentioned was maintain fire or initiate fire, but fire was the primary thing. And so with these longleaf pine forests, we have to have fire to move it to those kinds of desired conditions. And so, you know, that when we're working with forests that have some history of fire, it's a matter of getting fire in there. And the point of this presentation is not to talk about all the different ways of doing fire. There's a lot of information out there, but of course, those who are fire practitioners, you know all about the different kinds of fuel conditions and burning conditions and how you utilize those to achieve different objectives and how you would apply those in different situations. But the key, no matter how you apply the fire, what kind of fire you get, is to keep fire in that system. Now, in some cases, excuse me, there are forests where fire has been excluded for whatever reason for quite a long time. And that is a much different process than working with a forest that has had that history of fire. So generally that tends to be a really slow process to reintroduce fire in those situations, largely because of the high levels of accumulated fuels that have built up. And so even if there's competing vegetation that you want to control a fire, the first thing to do is get the fuels under control. And if, you know, doing that under very restricted burn conditions, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. On the last bullet there, you can see going back to Morgan Varner's paper from quite a while ago now, but there's other papers along with that. And there's also kind of a general fact sheet. I've given you the link there on Tall Timber's website that looks at some of the things to consider when reintroducing fire. And one of the big things when people started trying this that they found is with those heavier fuel loads, and especially in older forests, they ended up with some mortality on some of the oldest trees because of the heavy fuel loads around the base of the trees that smoldered for a long time and kept heat around the base of the trees, killed a lot of the fine roots of those trees. And over time, then those trees would die because of the loss of the fine roots and then other stressors that came in after that. So it is kind of a tricky thing to reintroduce fire when you haven't been using it in these forests, but it's not impossible to do. And so that's pointing you to some of these other sources to begin that search if you're not familiar with it. I know a lot of people listening are probably very familiar with doing that. So when thinking about ecological silvicultural approaches in longleaf pine, the way that the Jones Center approached it during my time there, and a lot of other people have picked up on, is looking at the Stoddard-Neal approach. Now, this approach was named after Herbert Stoddard, of course, one of the early developers of the whole realm of wildlife ecology, wildlife management, and his protege, Leon Neal. And so Herbert Stoddard came to South Georgia, North Florida area back in the 30s, well, 20s and 30s, and stayed there working as a forest manager through all the rest of his life, and developed a system for managing the longleaf pine as well as the other pine forests that preserved a lot of the characteristics, not just managing for tree growth. And because he came at it initially from a wildlife background, is he really had a lot of insight into a lot of those other characteristics to do. So he was practicing this. Eventually, Leon Neal in 1950 started working with him, and over time took over and continued refining and adapting that approach, and then passed it along. I guess this is a personal thing. This is Leon kind of talking to me at one point in time. I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time over 20 years working with Leon, following Leon around, just listening to Leon. And he did that with a lot of people. I'm not the only one. And, you know, he was very good about sharing those ideas and the real conservation ethic in that. One of the big things that I like to point out, though, is that sort of a caveat is they developed their approach to management on these shooting plantations where the objectives were for aesthetics, wildlife management, and hunting, as well as timber production. So they were utilizing a lot of the resources, but it was in a very specific sort of situation. And it was also developed in a time which is very different from the world in which we live today. But still, a lot of the basic concepts still apply today. So if you want to find out more about the Stoddard-Neal approach, there's been a lot written about it over the years. And so on the left, I've just given a list of some of the central tenets of the Stoddard-Neal approach that characterize what they do. The important ones is it's more holistic. It's not focused just on timber. That continuity that was mentioned from the concepts for ecological silviculture is Leon used to characterize as maintaining that perpetual multi-age canopy. The patience and thinking long-term gets at the timing and thinking about natural disturbances relative to our practices, utilizing the resources, but in a conservative way. And then really considering how the removals that you do through a harvest affect every other resource, not just the other trees, but the wildlife and the other plant life and all of that. And many of you have already seen this, but it's interesting to note that Aldo Leopold, who is much more famous than Herbert Stoddard or Leon Neal, was actually a contemporary and a friend of Herbert Stoddard and visited him in Florida and Georgia at different times. And I can't remember the date on this right now, but it was a long time ago. He came back and wrote to someone else about having visited with Herbert Stoddard recently, and thought that this approach to forest management that Herbert Stoddard was developing and practicing was had wide applicability, not just on these areas, these private properties where Herbert Stoddard tended to work, but could be used by a lot of other organizations and landowners just because of the broad focus on things beyond the trees. And so before moving on, this is where, Jeff, I put in the break for questions. And so.
Perfect time for a break, Steve. So that's great. And I definitely, the broad, a broader focus for our management. That's kind of where the series is heading. How do we do that? So there's some good questions that I think I'm going to add. Focus on one by Allie, and then Jennifer followed up on that. And so Allie was really relating to bringing up the point of indigenous people have been doing this type of management in longleaf pine systems for millennia. And so she asked, has there been collaborations with tribes related to longleaf pine restoration and management? And then there's a follow-up that Jennifer brings up, and that is, what is the frequency and extent of fire prior to colonization based on now? So they're related. So I'll let you take on those two.
Okay. Yeah, I'll work with the indigenous people. I'm not aware of a lot that's gone on for long periods of time, but I know of some that has been happening more recently with some of the native peoples that are within the range or whose lands are within the range of the longleaf pine. And so I'm not directly aware of it, but I'm aware of some that has happened, say, in North Carolina. And that I have to admit, that is not an area I am overly familiar with, but I know some has been happening here in East Texas, like across the range with the Longleaf Restoration Initiative. There are the various implementation teams, and the Texas Longleaf team has, in the last couple of years, begun engaging with a couple of the tribes here locally to bring them into our longleaf restoration processes. And so the Alabama Coshada tribe, which is southeast of here and is more down by the Big Thicket in southeast Texas, their lands are there on the edge of the Big Thicket, which is one of the primary longleaf pine areas here in East Texas. And so by engaging with them, we've begun some of that here in Texas. But I think, again, to my knowledge, a lot of that here in the southeast with longleaf pine is fairly early stages of the interaction. In terms of historically, yes, there was you get a lot of different just lost a word. Anyway, there are in terms of the fire return intervals historically in longleaf pine, they're all over, and it somewhat depends upon the site, but generally it tends to be short. There's a lot of debate whether all of that was from lightning, how much of it was from the indigenous people setting fires, and and so you'll find research papers going in both ways. That there was a whole debate. I think it's died down now about what's the appropriate season to burn longleaf pine, because if it was dependent mostly on lightning strikes starting the fires, then that tends towards the growing season, just when we get the lightning storms. But if the indigenous people were helping to start a lot of these fires, then it doesn't have to be limited to that growing season kind of fire. And I think now a lot of that, again, that debate has died down. There's a recognition that the native peoples did start a lot of fire, and they utilized fire a lot. It depended on where they were and the ways in which they used the forest. whether more agrarian or hunting sort of based. But they did use fire for a lot of different reasons, and you can find a lot of information on that. So a lot of the frequent fire was from humans, pre-European humans, utilizing the landscape and realizing that fire was a big part of it, as well as the lightning struck fires. So again, that debate is pretty much died down because everybody agrees it's more important to just get fire out in the longleaf pine forest, regardless of the season. And they're, anyway,
Right.
I've rambled enough.
No, that's good. So I won't ask you any more questions now, but we'll have more questions at the end. I will say that a couple folks, Sylvia and Marisol, shared a couple links. One was the history of fire in the southern United States, and another was related to pre-Columbian Native American uses of fire. So it's in the chat if people want to take a look at those. And with that, I'll take it away, Steve, and then we have a few more questions at the end.
All right.
For you at least. Okay, thank you.
Need to hurry up here. All right, so in terms of thinking back to that table and how we actually utilize the ecological silviculture approach from those different starting points, again, if we think about that line that was, or the row that was maintenance and having multi-age stands, really it's the most important thing is maintaining the fire regime. And then there are different ways that you can harvest trees. The pictures there are examples of trees marked for individual tree selection. So those of you not from the Southeast here tend to mark the trees that are being removed rather than trees that are being left behind. So you see a lot of paint on those trees. Those are the trees that are coming out. And again, it can be individual tree selection like this example, or it could be group selection. And there's been a lot of interest in the economics, and the economics compare pretty favorably to the even age, more intensive sorts of systems. Though if you look at something like internal rate of return, it's not quite the same. So the maintenance there, the biggest thing is maintaining fire and then doing the harvest in ways that mimic some of the natural disturbances. And I'm a jazz fan, and so I just like to throw this in here. Those that seen me present before have seen this before. My analogy, Miles Davis saying it's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. In this ecological silviculture approach, when we're talking about selecting trees for removal, it's really the trees that you leave behind that are most important, not the trees that you're asking or that you're saying will be removed. So in my mind, anyway, there's a parallel between that statement from Miles Davis. One of the other starting points that I had in that table was if you're starting from a plantation. And so here's a series of pictures showing, in this case, an old field just covered in, I won't say weeds, but a various plant cover. Plant longleaf pine in there. They start growing up. Eventually, you end up with a closed canopy plantation. And underneath that plantation is not a whole lot. A lot of pine straw, some plants, some of the ground cover plants, some which may be what you want, some like rubus species that aren't what you want. So you get to this point and it's not really those desired conditions that you want. So begin to think about how to transition that over time towards the desired conditions. So this just shows going from a plantation towards some of those desired conditions of a more natural forest. And so one case study, an example, and this is from the Jones Center at Itchaway. There's an area where longleaf pine was planted in 1987 on an area that had been in agriculture. And it was planted at fairly high densities with bare root seedlings. And at age 17, so in 2004 was the first time that we went in to that stand and did just like you would in any young plantation in the South. We did a third row thin, and did some other selections. The trees that were left behind actually started producing some seed as their crowns expanded. We began to recruit some regeneration, did a second thin 10 years later. And so now we had some wide areas in there, and had two thins in. I forgot to mention that it's in there that there was some direct seeding and native grasses into that stand. So we began to introduce the ground cover, and things were looking pretty good. And then 3 years after that second thin, we had a tornado that moved through that stand, and a year after that, a hurricane came through. And but I will say that even though it was a fairly young plantation at 31 years, and it was transitioning towards more of a natural state, the hurricane didn't destroy it, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. So the idea is that through a process of things that you would normally do in a plantation, and then begin to transition to other sorts of practices that normally are not part of a plantation management, you can begin to move the plantation towards that more multi-age and natural looking longleaf pine. Also, then the restoration from the bottom line in that initial table, if you're starting with a mature stand that is either degraded longleaf pine or doesn't have longleaf pine. So in this case, showing a pine canopy, and created some openings which were planted to longleaf pine, and several years later, then those longleaf pine are established beneath the canopy of a different species. So showing that sequence, and I have a couple examples here. So if it's a degraded longleaf pine stand, because fire hasn't been in there, the hardwoods have been to take over the understory and the midstory, it's not the wildlife habitat, at least for the species of concern that are normally associated with a fire-maintained longleaf pine system. Then there are some steps that you can do to begin to move that, and these parallel what's in the table. So this is what the forest started as in this kind of shape. You can see the predominance of hardwoods, a couple of longleaf pine pointed out with the arrows. So after the initial removal in different treatments to reduce that hardwood component and planting some longleaf pine, at some point in the future, then you begin to see those longleaf seedlings, which were planted out there, to begin to come up. And so you have some of those longleaf pine in the overstory that were there originally, and you've got another age class of longleaf pine coming up. And of course, the big thing about this, along with the harvest treatments to remove some of the hardwoods, was the application of frequent fire, and at times some pretty intense fire, to begin to move it to that later state. And then thinking about the case where you have not a degraded longleaf pine stand, but a completely different stand or a different pine species in the overstory. And so in this case, it's an example of an older slash pine stand, again, at the Jones Center. And you can see here, when this treatment was begun, you have a mature slash pine in the overstory and a pretty woody, hardwood dominated midstory and ground cover. And so with some harvest treatments and creating some gaps and planting longleaf pine out there, began to recruit more of the longleaf pine, which eventually will grow up. And this picture was taken in 2016 and was back there last fall, so 7 years after this. And there are multiple age classes of these young longleaf pine now coming up under that slash pine canopy. So it is something that people have tried in different places in the longleaf range and in different ways. But the idea is, if you want a longleaf pine forest, rather than cutting down the other pine species and starting over from scratch, you use those other pine species in the canopy for the structure that they provide, the fuels for fire, and over time transition through underplanting of the longleaf pine towards that desired longleaf pine composition. So those are some examples that illustrate what we had in that table for the ecological silviculture approach from the different starting conditions. But then the thing to think about, given the topic for this webinar series, is how does all this apply to a changing climate, and where are we at with longleaf pine and the ecological silviculture approach when we start thinking about the climate changing? And really, it's kind of interesting because for longleaf pine is drought tolerant. It's fairly resistant to strong winds. Of course, it tolerates fire. And so you begin to wonder, with the changes that are predicted, and we'll look at a map in a minute, is there a possible, not restriction of the range of longleaf pine, but potentially a range expansion because of those characteristics above. But things that are affected by the changing climate, and one that's very important since this is a fire forest, are thinking about what days will we have for burning. We now burn with prescribed fire, and how many days are we going to have within prescription for the fires that we want to have in these forests? Also thinking about the responses to severe disturbances, and especially some things like hurricanes that are now seem to be becoming more prevalent, and for this species, which is found largely in the coastal plain. And then because a lot of the interest in longleaf pine and restoring longleaf pine is tied to a lot of the wildlife species associated with that forest type, it's interesting to think about how any changes to the longleaf pine forest will affect the endangered species specifically that are associated with that longleaf pine forest. So things like the red cockaded woodpecker, the gopher tortoise, and things like that. If the climate is going to detrimentally affect longleaf pine, what effect will it have on the wildlife communities associated with it? And so there's a link there to an interesting summary of some of those thoughts that's on the Tall Timbers website, and that can lead you to some of the research where people have looked at that. But in terms of the response of longleaf pine, if you go to the Climate Change Atlas, the link is there at the top of the page, you can look up a lot of the forest species. So pulled up longleaf pine, and on the left you have the current range. You've seen that a lot here, and that the little blocks there are based upon the FIA data that the Forest Service collects, and where they found longleaf pine, and how prevalent it is in those plots. And so on the left is what you see, and then they run through. You can do different modeling scenarios with the different climate change models and the different emissions and all of those sorts of things. And so on the right, what I have is an average of 3 of the global climate models, and under the lower moderate emissions rather than the higher emissions standard, just to pull up an example. And what's interesting to see is, based upon that model, at least areas which might be suitable for longleaf pine now, there is an expansion away from the coastal plain, more up into the Piedmont, and up out of the coastal plain into different site types, and also a northward expansion beyond. Presently, it's limited pretty much to the southeast corner of Virginia, but under this scenario, we're going up north, and even if you went to the higher emissions model, it actually even shows possibilities up here in Massachusetts. It's hard to imagine longleaf pine in Massachusetts, but according to the change in climate, it could be possible that longleaf pine would do well there. The one interesting thing that, to me anyway, located here in East Texas, is that the expansion does not go any farther west than where we are currently. And so that One of the things, of course, is that there are predicted to be longer and more extreme drought conditions from time to time with the changing climate, and that's really what's limiting the westward expansion from this point. So we're really not going to go any farther west, but under climate change, longleaf pine potentially could go farther north in different ways. Now, some of those other factors to look at, here's the reference is up here. Kupfer et al. Did a study, again, with some modeling, looking at conditions and comparing that to burn prescriptions and wondering about, well, what will be generally in the Southeast, what will be the effect on the number of burn days that we have available as climate changes. And under the different models, you can see here, the cool season burns, winter burns are not greatly affected. The transition, sort of the spring type weather is in between full cool season and growing season. There are some changes depending on the model that's run, but really what we're going to be losing are some of those growing season, the summer burn days. And so that's going to restrict a lot of our burning to these other times of the year when there's already a lot of burning that's trying to occur. And you add to that some of the new regulations on smoke management and air quality, and things could get even more interesting in terms of trying to do all the burning needed. And you can see the same thing here, losing those later season burns. We out of time, Jeff?
You still have 5 minutes, Steve.
Okay.
So, but it would be nice, it would be nice to be able to take a couple questions. So
yeah, I'm finishing up here. This is a study out of the Jones Center after the Hurricane Michael came through. Here's Itchaway. Here's the track for the storm. I clicked it by mistake. Just looking at how different species of oaks and pines were affected by the hurricane winds. And these are different soil types for longleaf pine, but there was a lower probability of longleaf pine being blown over on all soil types. It varied by soil types, but comparing these probabilities to the other species, you can see longleaf pine does fairly well with those high intensity windstorms. Just to finish up, Hurricane Michael did go through Itchaway, and so seeing some of the things that, some of the damage that occurred from that, including some RCW trees, you can see a lot of snap trees blown over, all of those things from that storm going so close by. These were from some monitoring plots before and after the storm, seeing the number of downed trees. But and then that plantation that I showed, the big point is that because of that ecological silviculture approach, you had other age classes there. Even though we lost a lot of canopy trees, you still had a lot of longleaf pine, both in the overstory and regeneration present on the site. And in the last few years since that storm, a lot of this younger age class has really exploded and is coming up. And there's still a lot of the overstory trees present. So good examples of ecological silviculture exist for longleaf pine. Longleaf pine appears to be pretty well adapted to some of the predicted changes in climate within its range. And ecological silvicultural approaches provide some resilience to the disturbances that are predicted to occur with the change in climate. So now I'm done, Jeff.
great job, Steve. So that, hey, I will have to say, not everyone can get Miles Davis into an ecological silviculture presentation. So way to go. No, that is great information passed along. So let me see if I can get to a couple questions here, because there are a couple good ones. I'm going to go to this question by Chuck Hunter first, because it really gets to the seasonality of your burns. And he says, while I agree with Steve, it's important to emphasize frequent fire. There are many T&E species dependent on longleaf habitats that require growing season fire to persist. For instance, for winter breeding amphibians in particular. And the desired ground cover conditions are generally better maintained when growing season fires are at least in the mix over time. So, for better control of the woody encroachment in dormant season than dormant season. So do you have comments on
No,
that?
Chuck and I have had this discussion many times over the years, so no, I don't. He's correct. I think really, and I probably didn't emphasize it enough. The ideal thing would be to have a mix. Some cooler season, some what the one study called the transition season, some in the growing season. The worry is that with climate change, that the data I showed there from that study towards the end is we might be losing the ability to do some of that growing season. And so I think in the future, that's going to be more difficult, but I agree. A mix of seasons is important. And depending on the conditions, growing season fire may be what's needed, at least for some number of years, to control other vegetation and provide the correct habitat.
And so, Steve, here's a quick one. This was from Hannah early on, and she had asked if you would share the map again from the beginning. I think she was talking about the various range maps of the original longleaf pine, and then what is the current fragmented range. And so while you're scanning back, I'll give you another question. And this one's from Cliff, and it's related to red cockaded woodpecker at Boggy Slough. And he says, there was a small population there. Has your restoration work with prescribed fire, has that helped the RCW populations you have at Boggy Slough?
The short answer is yes. When the foundation acquired Boggy Slough, there were two red cockaded woodpecker clusters, two breeding pair. And over the last few years, we've done a lot of habitat improvement efforts around those woodpeckers. Fire is a big part of that, but some of it we had to do other treatments so that we're able to effectively apply fire. And but now, as of this spring, we have 7 active clusters and I guess 14 birds moving into the breeding season, maybe 15 birds because we have 1 helper. So yes, we've had some success using fire and a lot of these same sorts of things I've been talking about, just not necessarily in longleaf habitat, more shortleaf, loblolly, and some longleaf mixed in.
Great. Okay, and thanks for showing the maps. All right, I'm going to give 2 quick questions. Again, we're going to try to run out here. We don't want to keep people too long. But one question relates, Charles asked early on, is there impact from feral pigs on the longleaf restoration?
Yes. Again, simple answer that has, we could go on for a very long time. Yes, of course, the feral hogs root up anything and everything. It's documented. If you plant longleaf pine seedlings, they like digging those up and getting the big roots and eating those. So, but even without planting longleaf pine out there, just the rooting that they do through these forests basically tears up everything. On the other hand, you could say, if you've got longleaf pine in the canopy, they're scarifying your soil for you and making a good seed bed. So, but they may come right back to the same area. But there is an impact. It depends really on the level of hog population that you have on any given location.
Thanks. And I guess we'll have to end it with this last one, and that is related to seedling, the genetic diversification of your longleaf seedlings. Is there, obviously many of the nurseries are looking for genetic modifications that make the trees grow faster and are, better, more efficient for commercial harvest. Are there nurseries that specialize in conserving genetic diversity of longleaf pine?
Not currently to my knowledge, but there has been some discussion and some recent work in the last couple of years. AdPlat with the Longleaf Alliance has been leading some of that. Of course, longleaf pine was left behind by the commercial tree nurseries that focused on primarily loblolly pine, some on slash pine, and not much was done with it. And plus the early genetic work showed that there was the within stand genetic variability was higher than regional genetic variability, or as high. Only recently has the interest in working on the genetics of longleaf pine for artificial regeneration has come back up. And I know one of the discussions is, do you take the real commercial route of, getting out of the grass stage and growing more quickly, which is what would make sense for commercial objectives, or do we focus on other things like survival and outplanting and maintaining higher genetic diversity in what we're planting out into a given area and things like that. But that's really only started up in the last couple of years again.
So that's a pretty good answer. So thanks a lot, Steve. That really interesting stuff. There are a few more questions, but we really did get to most of them. So I think we're going to wrap it there.